not been properly explained by the President. I think the President made a very strong statement to the American people about why we were going to use this for humanitarian reasons. And I think the Gaddafi regime is a brutal regime that should be replaced. And I hope that we can accomplish that. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio.
May I inquire of the Chair how much time remains for all?
Gentleman from Ohio has 3 minutes remaining. Gentleman from California has 45 seconds remaining, and the gentlelady from Florida has 1.5 minutes.
I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Members will be asked to vote on 2 resolutions, H. Con. Res. 51 and a resolution offered by Speaker Boehner, H. Res. 292, both of which address U.S. military involvement in Libya. I do not believe that H. Res. 292 is at odds with H. Con. Res. 51, but it's not a substitute for the resolution that Mr. Burton and others have worked on, and it's imperative that members clearly understand this, because the consequence of voting for one, that's the Speaker of the House resolution, and not the other, H. Con. Res. 51, ends up being an endorsement of unconstitutional action that was taken by the White House. So how does Congress deal with the failure of any president to adhere to the Constitution? If Congress does not challenge a president's dismissal of the clear meaning of Article 1, Section 8, then we will have tacitly endorsed a president's violation of the Constitution and guaranteed the perpetuation of future constitutional transgressions. A mild rebuke alone of the usurpation of a constitutionally mandated war power is insufficient to defend the Constitution. Many of us want to support our president, but the President has ignored Congress's assertion of the war powers by failing to obey the war powers resolution.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Reserve the balance of my time.
Okay. Gentleman reserves. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from California is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Just in closing our time in the debate, I would urge that I would take up Mr. Kucinich's comments. If you think there's been an inappropriate abuse of power here, voting for the Boehner resolution does not cure that. But the Constitution doesn't say the President must come to Congress and get a declaration of war. It says Congress must declare war. I agree very much with the thinking of my friend, the Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Rogers, that there are national security issues involved here as well as humanitarian issues, and that's why I oppose Kucinich. But the notion that the President has to come to Congress when Congress has the authority to address this issue directly through a declaration or through an authorization or a limited authorization is the right way to do it. And I urge a no vote on both the Boehner amendments and the Kucinich amendment.
All times expired for the gentleman. Gentleman from Ohio seeks recognition.
I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
There are those who may hesitate to support my resolution because of the supposed negative impact it will have on the NATO mission and on our image in the eyes of our NATO allies. In the weeks leading up to the war, the administration had time to consult with the Arab League, the United Nations, the African Union, but apparently had no time to come to this Congress for approval. If our image in the eyes of NATO is a reason to stay in Libya, the administration should not have committed the U.S. to a war of choice without consulting with Congress for an action that was so far outside that which is allowed by the War Powers Resolution. Far more damaging is a Congress that ends up being more concerned with our image in the eyes of NATO than our fulfillment of our constitutional responsibilities and the continued usurpation of the war power by the executive. Our loyalty to NATO and to our President, regardless of party affiliation, does not trump our loyalty to the United States Constitution. Reserves the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Anyone else seek To recognition. Gentlelady from Florida. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
May I ask the gentlelady if,
Yes, if the gentleman would yield.
Will she be closing or?
Yes, we will use the time to close.
Gentleman from Ohio has 1 minute. The gentlelady from Florida has 1.5 minutes.
I want to thank all members on both sides of the aisle who have participated in this important constitutional debate. What does it mean to defend the Constitution? Well, if you know that Congress very clearly has the power to declare war, if you believe the President violated the Constitution in this regard, then you cannot come to any conclusion other than to say that we stand up and defend the Constitution by voting for H-Con Res 51. Let us also defend the Founding Fathers and the doctrine of separation of power. Let us defend the doctrine of checks and balances. Let us defend the institution of the Congress of the United States. And as we stand here, having taken an oath to defend the Constitution, this, my friends, is our moment to stand up for that oath, to act in defense of the Constitution. I urge a yes vote on H-Con Res 51. I ask members on both sides of the aisle who I know are ready to step forward in this moment to join me. Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to yield the remaining time to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, a member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce and a captain in the U.S. Air Force Reserves.
Well, I appreciate the gentlelady for yielding. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at a moment in time. The Middle East is awakening to freedom. They're seeing the opportunities that lay before them that we've experienced for hundreds of years. And they're begging for freedom. You know, the greatest disinfectant to terrorism, it's not necessarily bombs, it's not necessarily armies, it's freedom. This war, this action in Libya, I believe sells itself. I believe it is in the United States' interest and in the interest of freedom-loving people everywhere to support it. But, Mr. President, you need to come to Congress, and you need to say what our interests are there and allow Congress to vote on that. Because I believe the actions in Libya sell itself. People all across are begging for this, and in 50 years, when boys and girls in school read about the Great Awakening in the Middle East and the wars and the consternation that we used to have to fight, and now you have a bastion of freedom, let us be on the right side of history. Let us be the ones that stood up with people that said we're going to throw off the reins of terrorism and the reins of dictatorship. This sells itself. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The Chair would remind all members that remarks in debate are properly addressed to the Chair, not to the President. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 294, the previous question is now ordered. The question is on adoption of the concurrent resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The noes appear to have it, and the concurrent resolution is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask a recorded vote.
Nays?
Correct.
The yeas and nays have been requested. Those favoring a vote for the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, proceedings will resume on questions previously postponed. Votes will be taken in the following order. House Resolution 292, House Concurrent Resolution 51. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. The second vote in the series will be conducted as a 5-minute vote. The unfinished business is on the vote on adoption of House Resolution 292, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 292, resolution declaring that the President shall not deploy, establish, or maintain the presence of units and members of the United States Armed Forces on the ground in Libya and for other purposes.
The question is on adoption of the resolution. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House today has been debating two separate and distinct resolutions on the use of U.S. forces in the Libyan conflict and, more broadly, the constitutional roles of the President and Congress. Two votes here, and that will do it for the day. The first one, a vote on the resolution by John Boehner, H. Res. 292, a resolution which opposes U.S. ground forces in Libya. It also demands from the President specifics on the operation, would require the White House to justify its strategy in Libya within 2 weeks' time, although it stops short of declaring that the administration is in violation of the 1973 War Powers Act. This is a 15-minute vote. The following vote will be on the resolution they just wrapped up, the Kucinich resolution, which would call for the immediate removal of U.S. military forces from the Libyan operation. So two votes here. This one's 15 minutes, and the second one is a 5-minute vote. And you're watching live coverage of the House here on C-SPAN. That will pretty much wrap up their work today. Yesterday they finished work on the Homeland Security bill for fiscal year 2012. And as part of that debate, in that debate yesterday, they narrowly defeated an amendment by Brad Sherman of California dealing with Libya. In that debate, that proposed amendment would have prohibited any funds from Homeland Security in 2012 to be used toward the operations in Libya. That failed by a vote of 208 to 213. The issue of Libya also came up last week in their debate over the defense authorization bill. They approved an amendment in the House that would bar the deployment of American ground troops to Libya. So that's not so much an issue as has been the focus here of the War Powers Resolution, and in the case of the Boehner Amendment here, calling on the administration to further clarify their strategy and approach to Libya within 14 days.
This vote. The yeas are 268. The nays are 145 with one answering present. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Business is the vote on adoption of House Concurrent Resolution 51, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 51, concurrent resolution directing the President pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution to remove the United States Armed Forces from Libya.
The question is on adoption of the concurrent resolution. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
And this is the second resolution. This is Dennis Kucinich's resolution on Libya. His resolution would call for an immediate end to U.S. involvement in the Libyan operations, the cooperation with NATO. And you saw just there a moment ago the resolution by John Boehner passed in the House by a vote of 268 to 145. This will do it for votes in the House for today and for the following week. They have a district week period coming up, and they won't return to debate until June the 13th. This after finishing up work yesterday on the first of 12 spending bills for fiscal year 2012. They passed the Homeland Security spending bill and then went on to work yesterday to take up the Military Construction and Veterans Programs bill for 2012. That is still being worked on. They're not going to get around to it this afternoon. That'll likely be one of the first items of business when they return the week of the 13th. But here on the House floor, 5-minute vote on the resolution by Dennis Kucinich.
On this vote, the yeas are 148 and the nays are 265. The concurrent resolution is not adopted. With that objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Speaker, I present a privileged report for printing under the rules.
Clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany H.R. 2112, a bill making appropriations for agriculture, rural development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies' programs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourns to meet at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, June 7th, 2011. When the House adjourns on that day, it adjourned to meet at 10:30 a.m. on Thursday, June 9th, 2011. And when the House adjourns on that day, it adjourned to meet at 2 p.m. on Monday, June 13th, 2011.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman's report is referred to the Union calendar and order printed. All points of order are reserved. What purpose, gentlemen?
I ask unanimous consent to remove Steve Stivers from House Con Res 58.
Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to 2 U.S.C. 285C in the order of the House of January 5th, 2011, the Chair announces the Speaker's appointment of Mr. Ralph B. Seep as Law Revision Counsel for the House of Representatives effective June 2nd, 2011.
Thank you so much. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Members, please take your conversations off the floor. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a personal request. Without objection, the request is granted. The House will be in order. Members, please take your conversations off the floor. The House will be in order. The Chair is prepared to entertain 1-minute requests. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Address the House for 1 minute and to revise an extent.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker,
Members, please take your conversations off the floor.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to congratulate the Korean Cultural Center of Chicago on the grand opening of a new cultural center in Wheeling. Because of the hard work and determination of the Korean Cultural Center, its president, Young-hee Chang, and her staff, its board of directors and supporters, we now have a focal point for the Korean American community in the Chicago area. The story of the Korean immigrant is an important part of Illinois' history, and we are fortunate to now have a facility.
Not in order. Will the gentleman proceed?
We are fortunate now to have a facility that is a repository and an exhibition of that story. The new cultural center will add a rich cultural tradition to the village of Wheeling, and it will also benefit the neighboring communities. I hope that it will also serve to strengthen the important relationship between the United States and the Republic of Korea. The opening of this new center is the culmination of many years of effort and is the cause for great celebration. Congratulations and best wishes on many years of success. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California arise?
To request 1 minute. Permission to revise and...
Without objection.
America's intervention in Libya was initially based on the international community's responsibility to protect, a mandate agreed upon in the wake of the horrific Rwanda genocide. This important international doctrine calls for the international intervention in a country where a government is unable or unwilling to protect its civilians or is actively assaulting and killing inhabitants in that country. I agree with this doctrine, and America's initial response to the Gaddafi threat to wipe out a large segment of the Libyan population. For 3 months, the U.S. and NATO have engaged in military action. At this time, it is unclear if the mission is any longer one that fulfills the responsibility to protect doctrine, or if it has changed into a larger and/or different role. Given the continued military action and the lack of clarity of the U.S. mission's goal, I support Resolution 292, which requires the administration to provide information on the American military, diplomatic, and humanitarian activities in Libya, and seeks clarity on America's objective and strategy to achieve that goal. I yield back my time.
The Chair lays before the House communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, pursuant to 44 U.S.C. 2702, I hereby appoint as a member of the Advisory Committee on the Records of Congress the following person: Dr. Sharon Leon of Fairfax, Virginia. With best wishes, I am, signed sincerely, Karen L. Haas, Clerk.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado arise? Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In the late 1880s, landmen circulated flyers throughout the country about a place in the Republican River Valley with fertile soil and plenty of open land, a place named Yuma, Colorado. By 1886, the town had established itself a school, churches, and a thriving ranching community. This year, the town celebrates its 125th year, a community defined by the cycles of Mother Nature, the Ogallala Aquifer, made vibrant by agriculture, and energized by businessmen and women who are constantly looking for new ways to be successful. A little town on the high plains of Colorado, population just over 3,000 people. Yuma has been home to a U.S. Open PGA champion, an Emmy winner, a National Book Award finalist, a Medal of Honor recipient, professional football players, some of the nation's leading farmers, ranchers, and business owners, and yes, even a member of the United States Congress. Yuma lies in the heart of Colorado agriculture. Yuma County is often the nation's leader in corn production. It's weathered the boom and bust of farm prices, hailstorms, drought, and wind. For a small town, it seems like no matter where you go, you find someone who is either from there, lived there, or has family there. In many ways, it's one of the biggest little towns in the nation. From its old Thresher Days celebration in the fall and the Yuma County Fair to high school sports and academics, it's an incredible place to live, to raise a family, to grow, and to do business. I am proud to call Yuma, Colorado home. Congratulations on 125 years, and here's to wishing the people of that great town many more years of success. I yield back my time.
Has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Delaware arise? Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This week, the Democratic and Republican caucus met with President Obama to discuss the need to increase the debt ceiling. The President said that we need to raise the debt ceiling soon, and I agree. Defaulting on our debt is not an option for a great nation like ours. No one wants to send the economy into another tailspin. Now is the time to restore fiscal discipline. That's what the American people, the global financial markets, and U.S. creditors expect. And that's why I support the attachment of a strong deficit reduction plan to any increase in the debt ceiling. Congress should attach a balanced and broad-based budget plan to the debt ceiling increase. The plan should include smart cuts that would total at least $4 trillion over the next 10 years. The budget agreement should also protect important investments in a strong economic future. We can't delay any longer. We can't pass these tough decisions on to our children and grandchildren. The people we serve sent us here to get this done, and it's time for both sides to do just that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana arise? Without objection.
Well, Americans awoke this morning to the heartbreaking news that unemployment has increased to 9.1%. The U.S. economy added only 55,000 jobs in the last month. The American people are understandably concerned. But the numbers don't tell the tale. Beneath those numbers are literally millions of American families who meet this morning's headlines with heartbreak and heartache because the opportunities just aren't there. The truth is, more government, more spending, more regulation, and more taxes of the recent past are stifling our recovery, but nothing is stifling our recovery more than runaway spending in Washington, D.C. Even as we speak today, Congress and this administration are locked in a debate over increasing the nation's credit card, increasing the debt ceiling. And let me say from my heart, some people don't see the connection between the debate over they are related. If we will take the decisive step to put our fiscal house in order, we will restore confidence in capital markets, and businesses and individuals will invest in ways that will put Americans back to work. No debt ceiling without real and meaningful cuts in the way we spend the people's money in the short term and the long term. Get spending under control in Washington, D.C., and we'll get this economy moving again.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas arise?
Ask to address the House.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Speaker is to be commended for bringing these two bills to the floor. Unfortunately, we have a president who cared more about what the Arab League and the UN thought than he did his own elected Congress. We've been kept in the dark about his decisions, the basis for them, and I'd vote no on our Speaker's bill because he didn't need any more time. And the President should be aware, Madam Speaker, that there are an awful lot of people that are ready to switch their votes and vote yes. I would prefer that we not do it through the war powers. We could do like Democrats did in '74, just cut off the spending. It is ridiculous. He said we'd enforce a no-fly zone, that's it. We wouldn't put ground troops in Libya. He said that NATO was going to take over and we wouldn't be that involved. Wrong on all counts. We know from the rules of the House the President wouldn't lie, but he sure is misrepresenting things. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Every member of this body, every elected official in the United States, every member of our military takes an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. We do not take an oath to the President of the United States. The war in Libya is the President's war. The Constitution requires that Congress declare war. The War Powers Declaration requires that Congress be authorized and notified if the President leads us into war. This has not occurred. The President's war in the name of humanity, although it may be a good idea in the moral sense, and Gaddafi is a rotten person, it violates the Constitution of the United States. It violates statutory law that we have passed, and it is incumbent upon this body to stop the war in Libya that is the President's war and not the war of the people of the United States. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Madam Speaker, good afternoon. I request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This House has just had a great constitutional debate about the meaning of Article 1, Section 8, where the founders made it very clear that the war power is placed in the hands of Congress. This debate that occurred today is not an end. It's a beginning. It's a beginning because we have seen one resolution which derived its presence from a resolution that I put forward on a bipartisan basis. One resolution passed which put the White House on notice that Congress is beginning to take a more appropriate role with respect to the Constitution. And that's a good thing. But make no mistake that this issue of Libya is not going to go away. With the spending soon approaching $1 billion, with NATO openly talking about commission of ground troops, we'll be back here another day to consider further what our appropriate constitutional role is. I want to congratulate members on both sides of the aisle, no matter how you voted. This is our moment to begin to reclaim the Constitution. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana rise? Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just today, we got the bad news again that the jobless numbers have gone up, our unemployment numbers have gone up, much smaller job increases were created than were expected. And I think as we continue to see unemployment going up over 9%, 9.1% now according to the latest numbers, it's very clear that the President's spending and borrowing agenda has been a dismal failure. And yet the President continues to go down that path. It's time for the President to start working with the House Republicans who have sent job bill after job bill over to the Senate, and for whatever reason the President and the liberals in the Senate don't want to address the ability that we have presented to create jobs. One real clear example is in our state in Louisiana, where we've lost over 13,000 jobs because of the President's policies, where they won't let our people go back to work drilling safely for energy in America. We don't want to go get our energy from Brazil or from the Middle Eastern countries, many of whom don't like us, and use the billions we send to them to do us harm. We can keep that money here. We can keep those jobs here. There is a plan to do it, and plan after plan has been sent to the Senate, and for whatever reason, the Senate and the President continue to ignore it. Let's finally get our economy back on track. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any further one-minute requests? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas arise? Without objection. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
I thank the Speaker. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I believe it is important when we finish what sometimes may seem as a complicated debate where both sides can seemingly make sense, or when we've had the time or do have the time to reflect upon the week's work or the work and philosophies of the different political perspectives in this House, it is very important to communicate with your colleagues. So let me be as clear as I can be, as I heard my friends on the other side of the aisle, one after one, claim that the Libyan war was the President's war. Well, today on June the 3rd, 2011, the President of the United States happens to be President Barack Obama. But if you look at the Constitution of the United States that provides provisions for the separation of powers, there is a section that articulates that the Congress, irrespective of any presidential person in place, declares war. So I'd ask my friends on the other side of the aisle, would they have been as quick to rise to the floor on the Iraq War, which could be called the Bush War, or the continued 10-year-plus war in Afghanistan, the Bush War. When we discuss these issues for the American people, we have to be true to ourselves and the Constitution. There was a reason why the Founding Fathers separated out the right to declare war. And that reason, of course, was to protect you, the American people, that when we send men and women into battle, it should be a deliberative process. But we should also have the right to defend ourselves. The initial attack in Afghanistan, that was the first act, was in response to the heinous and horrific attack of al-Qaeda on the soil of the United States. From my perspective, the immediate response of President Bush was legitimate. The question becomes, what came afterwards? And the Congress was never given the chance to declare war. Subsequently, there was a statutory discussion and vote that gave unending opportunities and authority for the war to go on and on and on. Buried in the Afghanistan decision was the authority to go on and on and on. The sad part about it was that we did not go on in Afghanistan. We distracted our troops and went into a war that saw the large numbers of our soldiers lose their lives, in a war that had actually never been declared by the United States of America and the United States Congress. We have something today in 2011 called the Arab Spring. But I don't think Americans understand that. And they frankly believe that we cannot promote democracy everywhere in the world. Policymakers understand the crucialness of what is going on in the Arab area as it relates to the geopolitics, the political structure of the world. But I know what Americans of goodwill do understand: the slaughter of a people, the slaughter and the misuse of power in Bahrain, the misuse of power in Egypt, the gruesome misuse of power to the extent that a mutilated body of a 13-year-old boy can be dumped in their parents' home in Syria. And yes, the violence in Libya. Americans understand that, and I understand it. And so I applaud the President of the United States for going in Libya to stop the horrific violence. He went in coalition with our NATO troops. That same action occurred under President Clinton, going in with NATO, taking the lead in this instance, in the slaughter of Muslims in Kosovo and the horrible wars in Bosnia. I so happened to have been able to go on an initial inaugural mission into Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia, and Croatia, and I walked the streets of Sarajevo and I saw mothers who asked that they had not seen their sons for 10 or 12 years and asked us where they were. It was a violent time. So the Libyan action by the President was an appropriate one. He happens to be a Democratic President. I applaud his actions. But the Constitution is not labeled by Democratic or Republican. It has no provisions to exempt if you happen to be a Democrat with a Democratic president. And so my values argue for consistency, and that is adhering to the Constitution. I believe the Resolution 252, Mr. Boehner's resolution that was crafted in the last 24 hours, was a nice statement about a report. But I don't vote on actions on the floor out of contempt and dislike for anyone. Let me be very clear. I applaud President Barack Obama for the courage that he has taken in moving forward to establish America's mark as a believer in democracy and justice, and encouraging the people in the Arab states to stand up for their rights and to object and reject the oppressiveness of their regimes. And I hope that NATO becomes strategic in what they are doing so that we can be successful. But if we are going to be true to the Constitution of the United States, that is in fact part of the document that we hold true, then we must hold any commander-in-chief to the same standard. The War Powers Resolution asks that the President of the United States comes to the Congress in 60 days. The constitutional provision in Article 2 requires that the Congress declare war. One could argue that we have not declared war on Arab states and we've not declared war on Libya. We're at war. We're at war because al-Qaeda declares that they're at war with us. And so it is a dicey circumstance. I instead voted for the action to occur under the War Powers Resolution that was just occurring today, a vote that we lost, a vote that I would have voted for under President Bush, under President Reagan, under President Carter, and with the opportunity under President Clinton, as the wars proceeded to a long extent of time. However, we are dealing now in the backdrop of a failed resolution. But I voted because it is necessary to be consistent on whether you believe the Constitution and the authority of the Congress and the separation of three branches is a valid one to protect the rights of the American people. And I believe that. But my message to General Gaddafi is this: if you have any sense of human dignity left, you will stop the murderous attacks on your people. I am sensitive enough to offer my sympathy to you for the loss of your family members, because I believe in the value of human life. But war is ugly. But every entree of peace that we have offered to you has been one that you've ignored. Every effort that we have made, rather than entree, every step that we have made toward peace, you have ignored. You have arrogantly insisted on the world stage that you're in charge, while your country is in a state of confusion and disaster. You have opened the doors to the confusion and the violence of terrorist cells, Al-Qaeda, and other ne'er-do-wells who desire no good to you or your people. You've allowed groups to, in essence, begin to spark so that the continued frustration of world leaders in trying to bring resolution continues, but more importantly, the violence of all falls on the backs of innocent women and children, young boys and families in Libya. I feel a kinship to the Libyan people as a human being and as someone whose heritage started on the continent of Africa. But the one good thing about America is that we care about all people, no matter what background they come from, no matter what country. I know that because I've had the privilege of representing the United States in South and Central America, in Asia, on the continent of Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe and other places maybe not mentioned, because we care. Mr. Gaddafi, I beg of you, as an African who has met with the President of South Africa, who knows that the African Union would like for him to cease and desist this violent attack on your own people, stand down. And I would ask, as I've asked before, leave the country. Let us find the kind of government that might, in fact, move Libya forward. And if your people decide that you should stay, then you should have a reformation and a change not only of mind but of heart. The violence does not get you anywhere, and it is both insane and absurd. So I would hope that as this vote was taken, that it is not in any way, as was evidenced by the discussion and the debate by the Republicans, it is not Mr. Obama's war. He is the President of the United States and the Commander-in-Chief. And it was a determination to go in to stop the murderous acts of those who were killing innocent people. Read your early history. The early founders of this nation in the Revolutionary War against Great Britain had other countries come to the aid of this little tiny baby series of states that call themselves the United States of America. It has been the world order for centuries that big countries or those who are able will go to the aid of those who are not able. And this vote today should not in any way deny the respect that is owed to the President of the United States. This is a vote premised on the Constitution and reflecting the desires of the American people, that we do not live in a dictatorship, and that if you're a member of the United States Congress, come here and do your job. And our job is defined by the Constitution. I believe that our duty was partly handled today, and I would encourage our President, as he has done over the stages of the Afghan war and now the continued redeploying in Iraq of our soldiers, I would ask that we are in an engagement of discussion that gives us the roadmap for redeploying or moving toward a resolution in Libya. I would also join in the debate that I've just made on the question of Libya with the need for the immediate review and designation of time for redeployment of our troops out of Afghanistan. And the President has indicated that he expects that that redeployment will begin in July 2011. My plea to the President is, as we look at these economic times, when America is crying out for jobs, when the middle class feels splashed and unattended to, when others believe our jobs are not creeping offshore and overseas, but fleeting and flying and literally by way of speed that is faster than sound. It is time now to find the mutual courage to say to the people of Afghanistan that we have provided a duly elected government, a parliament. We have laid down our lives. We have built up the Afghan National Security Forces, of which I was introduced to, and the many times that I've been into Afghanistan, all parts, including Kabul and Kandahar and places beyond. I know there are good people there. And so I'd ask the President of the United States to ramp up the redeployment, bring home 50,000, 100,000 troops, and begin to let those troops rebuild their lives. Invest in military readiness and preparedness, and find a closure to the presence of United States boots on the ground in Afghanistan. To President Karzai, I ask you to stand up and be counted, to initiate policies that would end the poppy growing and heroin production, to allow girls and boys to go to school, to produce your teachers and lawyers, doctors and scientists, generals, captains and leaders of government. I would ask President Karzai to provide the funding and resources for your Afghan National Security Forces. I'd ask him to weed out the Taliban that is destroying his own people in the mountains of Afghanistan. And yes, I would ask whether or not it is even possible that all of us could claim the value of peace. And by doing that, it would not be non-courageous to stand up and accept the fact that we have won in Afghanistan and we won in Iraq, and we thank our soldiers. And so I'm on the floor today thanking my colleagues, because last week we voted 419 votes, 419 votes to declare a National Day of Honor for our returning troops from combat areas, more than we've ever done in any other war, and to celebrate them all over America. So I'm not asking for America to leave any battle place with their head held down. Our Vietnam vets, during a very tumultuous time in a war that we disagreed with, should have been welcomed home for their service, for their duty, for the reason that they took up arms, not of their own accord, but because a president called them. And I believe America learned her lesson as she focused now, or as she focuses on trying to help our returning combat veterans with jobs and education and health care. We know that we should honor them. So the amendment that I passed on the floor, 419 votes, I hope the American people will call their congresspersons, thank them, but also ask that that proclamation be declared and that we have a National Day of Honor to welcome our soldiers home from all around the world in combat places. As we welcome them home, I think it is extremely important to recognize that America has a number of concerns. Those concerns are the tragedies that we face, the horrific loss of life in Joplin, Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, all the flooding that has gone on. People in the United States are suffering. So what does it mean to raise the debt ceiling? What it means to raise the debt ceiling is not what Americans believe. There they go again, spending, spending, spending. What it actually means is that we're saying to working Americans and middle-class Americans, we feel deeply about your inability to pay your mortgage, to pay tuition costs. if you have 1 or 2 credit cards with those old interest rates of 19, 20, 21% that we've been able to bring down somewhat because of legislation we've passed, we understand that. If you don't have a job, if someone in your life doesn't have a job, we understand that. We understand folk that don't have a job, but they don't have a job, a home, a car, a place to live. What the debt ceiling actually is the ability to pay our bills. It is not the ability to spend and find ways to spend monies unnecessarily. It is the ability to create the jobs that America is crying out for. The 9% is not a reflection so much of the President of the United States not desiring and working hard to create jobs. Let me remind my colleagues that it was Democrats and the President that helped to, in essence, provide a safety net for the automobile industry. A lot of people complained about that. But we were in the middle of the fight not to pay special interest off, but we were in the fight to save the auto industry of the United States of America. It was the right thing to do. 2 big reasons. One, the infrastructure of automobile building was car dealerships across America that had thousands, millions of workers selling American cars. You let that industry collapse, and you would let, in essence, some small town in America literally have no economy. It might have been that the car dealership was the largest business in that small area. I'll add 3. The second is we obligated the industry to pay us back, and we have been paid back. We have been, the United States taxpayers have been paid back. And you know what else? They have actually brought jobs back to the United States of America. If I wasn't in this very august place, I would say hallelujah, celebrate, applaud. Jobs have been brought back to the United States. And I think some of you, the Ford, of course, did not take those resources. We applaud them. Some of you are buying some new smart cars by GM. Some of you are buying new smart cars by Chrysler. Better gas mileage. Got a new attitude. We gave the American innovative genius the opportunity to survive. We allowed inventiveness to thrive. We built on Henry Ford's genius, and we let it spread around. And as well as we develop jobs for monies that the taxpayers invested, and we put the right kind of restraint for you to be reinvested, the debt ceiling means that it allows us, the government, to create jobs for you. You churn the economy and invest back. We then provide the protection for you through jobs, or maybe unemployment insurance, or maybe Social Security, or maybe Medicare, or maybe when you're at your lowest ebb, when you have lost loved ones in a natural disaster that you cannot comprehend, it is the cause of the federal government to be able to pay the bills, to be able to come to a place where there's no fire station, no houses of worship, no hospital, no schools, no homes, for us to come and to be of help. I don't know how we can abdicate our responsibilities. I don't know how we can frivolously play with raising the debt ceiling. I don't know how Republicans can put on the floor of the House an amendment or a bill under suspension, which requires 2/3 votes, to make a joke of helping the people in Joplin, in Alabama, up and down the Mississippi, and whatever other disaster may come. How do you make a joke with that? How, in essence, do you in the face of the frustration of those who have suffered. I have not experienced a tornado, but I have experienced and walked the streets during hurricanes. I have seen in my own town the pain. I have come up to doors and knocked on persons' doors where someone is laid dying because they have just gone through a process where all the lights are out and they're on oxygen. I've seen seniors in homes that cannot be repaired. I've seen people lose items that can never be replaced. And so that is what your federal government does. And do you mean to tell me we would make a mockery of raising the debt ceiling so that America can simply pay her bills? There is a value to reducing the deficit. And might I just say something with all good intention? It is always the person who has got money in their pocket, who's got a wallet full of credit cards that they can pay for, that can smile when you're talking about Social Security and Medicare and has an uncaring spirit, because it doesn't matter to them. It is the philosophy that has not made this country great, the philosophy of, I've got mine, you get yours. Young people, I have gotten my college education. I don't care whether you can go to college or not. I don't even care if you get a job. I've got mine. That's not what this nation is all about. I will not tell the people of Missouri, Alabama, and places around, I'm okay in Houston. My house is still functioning. The hurricane season hasn't hit me yet, so I'm not going to worry about your tragedy. Is that America? Is that how we built the greatness of this country? Did we ignore our returning troops coming home from World War II? Or did we say to them, we're giving you the GI Bill? The Democrats gave the second GI Bill. President Truman gave the first. We gave, with President Obama, the greatest GI Bill in the history of America, except the one that was passed by President Truman. We said that we care. We built on the values of a country that always rises to the occasion. And because of that, those people who desire goodness and greatness, they look to the United States of America. I am glad, regardless of whatever faith we believe in, whatever our background is, or whoever's our neighbor, that we're a country that cares. And I will tell you, just if you follow what your grandmother says, being a good Samaritan will always come back to you. Being kind to someone will always come back to you. And therefore, I believe that it is imperative that we lift the debt ceiling for America to pay her bills. I am tired of smashing the middle class. I am tired of leaving them on their own. I am tired of them watching jobs go overseas when we have such a brilliant population of innovative, creative people, loving people. We overcame some of the hills and valleys in America. We went through the civil rights movement and the era where those who were of a different color suffered under the devastating indignity of segregation. America rose to the occasion. It is not perfect, but we recognize the value of equality of all. You're not relegated to the back of the bus. You're not dismissed from hotels and restaurants. You are open and allowed to travel on America's transportation modes. You even can be accepted into colleges on your own merit and not on quotas. And yes, if you apply for a job, the laws at least protect you, that no matter what your background, that you're given an equal opportunity. America has traversed some of those difficult valleys. We respect women and a woman's equality. We are able to say that women can be pilots and presidents and senators and doctors and heads of organization and engineers and train conductors and anything a little girl can admire and aspire to be. That's the kind of America that is understanding of the crisis that these people face. And I'm sorry that the debate on the debt ceiling has been characterized as Democratic and Republican, and these are the deficit cutters, and these are the wild-eyed spending spreeers going into the shopping malls of America and grabbing things off shelves. It's important to note that one of the greatest presidents that we've admired, my little girl used to call him Grandpa, Ronald Reagan asked the Congress to lift the debt ceiling in 1983. Not because he was a spendthrift, but because he understood the responsibilities of paying America's bills. And, my friends, I remind you, can we not pay America's bills? I want to discuss how we do that, how we lift the condition of Americans. We do it like we've done it before. We make it in America. Now, I like one part of it that says we make it in America. Everybody needs to have a chance to make it in America. The young people that are graduating in 2011 should have the right to make it in America. And by the way, might I just say congratulations to all of the graduates across America, from the preschooler that's going to kindergarten to the elementary child that puts on the robe and is inspired, to the middle school, and to the high school graduates, of whom I will go home to this weekend and greet any number of high school graduates in my constituency who are making that first leap of faith, to the college graduates who are feeling so empowered to graduate in such a great nation, to those who are getting graduate degrees, our new lawyers and doctors and business persons, our physicists and chemists and biologists, the geniuses that will go into the laboratories of America. Congratulations to all of you. That is why I believe it is important to make it in America. The Democrats have launched a major initiative. I wish we could get our friends to join us in a real jobs bill, of which the President of the United States has committed to introducing a real jobs bill to make it in America. Many of us in our hearings will ask the witnesses that represent the United States government, we want you to buy America and make it in America. And I'm not an isolationist. I believe America has been enormously generous in buying goods from other countries. Proud of them. Proud of them. We're glad to help developing nations. We're glad to support microcredits and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation that allows investments overseas. But we don't want our jobs. We don't want our jobs to be taken overseas. I don't want to see teenagers with double-digit unemployment, particularly in the African-American community. I don't want rural communities to suffer because of the lack of unemployment. I dread this coming summer when there's no money for summer jobs for young people who are trying to save for going into school in the fall. Sometimes the only resources a family has may be the summer job of a teenager. But we've always encouraged teenagers to learn how to work in the decorum of the workplace. Just look what we're doing now. For that very reason, can I give a challenge to this nation? Can I give a challenge to the businesses? Can I give a challenge to corporate America? Bring some young people, maybe unpaid, to be able to be interns. City governments, maybe unpaid, bring some young people into your offices. Teach them something else but hanging out on the streets. Let them see an adult role model working. But we might not have to have that kind of plea if we could make it in America again. We're going to be honoring, in the 18th Congressional District, in Texas, and all around America, we're going to be honoring the individuals who have manufacturing businesses. I'd ask you, colleagues, to go and shake the hand of a manufacturer who's making something, who's struggling to keep the doors open, who's making a widget or a gadget. That's what we're talking about. Solar panels. Wouldn't it be a shock if we went across America and began to make our own solar panels, our wind mills, of course, that create wind energy. Unfortunately, I would hate to tell you that that equipment, that kind of technology, we get from overseas. If I wasn't on the floor of the House, I'd hold my head down. When has America needed to depend on someone else, something that was their idea or that they could make better? Again, as I said, I don't mind being part of the world family, where we share and we buy items and we help develop economies, but not to the point where all our jobs, like I said, are taking wings and flying away. What kind of America is that for our young people that are graduating in 2011? And so I want us to focus on building buses, building submarines and major aircraft carriers, building bridges, freeways, improving dams, building the rail or the trains for high-speed rail, of which I am an avid supporter of, and it requires an investment in this country to be able to be fiscally conservative as well as to ensure that we use our energy resources right, to have an energy policy as well that speaks about all of the energy resources, to do them effectively as the President has articulated, and to make sure that if we are using fossil fuels, whether it's oil or gas, that we are doing it here in the United States and that we are, in fact, doing it safely and securely, that we appreciate wind and we make the equipment or the kind of technology right here in the United States, solar, that we make all of our panels, natural gas, that we do it safely and securely, and that we create jobs that way, that we bring down the cost of energy, that we stop calling upon the American people to take $5 out of their pocket and put a few ounces, if you will, of gas in their car, that we begin to recognize the pain of America. And the way that we recognize the pain of America is that we begin to go aggressively toward the American people with solutions. And the demagoguery of raising the debt ceiling and I'm not going to vote on it unless you burden it down with draconian cuts that will end Medicare as we know it on all seniors, eliminate Social Security, destroy Medicaid and throw it to the winds so that disabled children suffering from autism or those who have other diseases cannot be taken care of. That's not the America that has made us so great. It is one that pulls up our pants and put on our shoes, pulls up our skirts, and get empowered by the joy of work and helping others. And when we did that, we were able to invest in this nation. I will not vote on a debt ceiling increase that destroys Medicare as we know it, and I will not vote on a debt ceiling increase that destroys Social Security or Medicaid or violates the premises that this country owes a debt of gratitude to veterans and returning soldiers. And that's what my friends on the other side of the aisle are trying to sell the American people, a bill of goods. A bill of goods that the philosophy that is anti to President Reagan, who asked for the increase in the debt ceiling himself, that we cannot count and speak at the same time. I believe America is greater than that. We can bring down the debt rather, with a very meticulous plan over a period of time, the same way you save for college or plan to bring down your debt or stop using credit cards. We can do that. But at the same time, we can pay America's bills, and we cannot leave one American alongside of the road languishing and reaching out for help, and we say there's no room at the end. Where is the America that is a good Samaritan? Where is America that sent young men to war in World War II? And if you talk to any of that generation, they say, I didn't know all the facts, but I was glad to be part of what America was standing for. helping those who are languishing alongside of the road. We've had any number of conflicts, and some that I've agreed or disagreed with, but the premise was whether we had the agreement of the American people on the premise of that conflict, it was to help someone along the road. I am now calling in a clarion cry for Americans to help America. I am calling on this Congress for this Congress to help America. I'm calling on the President as a friend of the American people to help America. And to do that, whatever is heard that will now come behind me, and disjangled chords will sound attractive, and it will be about who is going to burden our grandchildren and the long-term debt, but it will not be infused with values by many of our faiths. Those of us of the Christian faith and many other faiths have an element of the document under which they worship that talks about the Good Samaritan and charity and love. And albeit that you are asking why on the floor of the House, it is because the infusion of those tenets were part of the design of this nation when we organized around the concept of forming a more perfect union, and when the Declaration of Independence said that we seek to pursue happiness. We hold these truths self-evident, that all of us are created equal. We don't abandon that just because it happens to be June 3rd, 2011. We're able to keep those values, and those values has kept this country on a straight and productive path. All the noise that comes sometimes in a confused sound to the ears of the American people, if as members of Congress we can declare our commitment to helping the American people and keeping the values of the American people in place and that of our faith, that is to help, to love, and to present charity to those who are in need, there is no limit to the greatness of America, and there is no limit to the restoration of making it in America, both in terms of our success and survival, and then in terms of making things that we need and putting America back to work. Madam Speaker, I am grateful for being yielded this time by the Speaker of the House, and I am grateful for the opportunity to live in a nation where disagreement does not result in this century and even in the past century of taking up arms against each other. I am grateful that maybe in the debate that we have on the floor of the House, at some point my colleagues can hear not disjangled sounds of discord and disrespect and dislike, but they can actually hear the chords of reason, my friends, that to pay for our bills as you pay for yours, we must do the right thing, raise the debt ceiling, and to be able to preserve Medicare as we know it, and not to destroy it as it is being destroyed by the budget proposals of the Republican Party. It is necessary, if you will, to be able to come together and to listen in one voice, finally, that we act to help America. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back my time.
The gentlelady from Texas yields back her time.